It's time for the Ultimate Nightfarer Guide. For all 8 Nightfarers, we're going to break down their playstyle, exactly how their skills work, best weapons, passives, relics, party compositions, and general tips. Let's go! Wylder's playstyle is best used as like a melee frontliner, but not necessarily a tank like a Raider or a Guardian, though they do have some capabilities to tank the grunt of damage from enemies anyway. For attributes, Wylder starts out with A, HP, C, FP, B, Stamina, Strength at A, Dex at B, and then the rest at C. So realistically here, he's solid across the board, but that Strength being the highest is what you want to focus on for those melee weapons. So typically the larger melee weapons like greatswords are the specialty for Wylder, but you've also got flexibility to use any dexterity-based weapons, or even flex in a little bit of incantations or spells, which I have done sort of in my offhand on occasion, depending on the gear that I get during that run. So flexibility is really the main game of Wylder, and that's also relevant in his kit, like Clawshot being his main ability to use it as like a distance closer. Now, if you want to play Wylder, I do think he's a fantastic starting option. It's probably why he is the poster child as well, because of his skills, but also because of the flexibility that you can really use anything that you find throughout each run. And then eventually, say if you really like using specific weapons or going down a specific path in expeditions, you can then specialize in one of the more specialist Nightfarers as sort of a progression off of Wylder. But he's definitely going to be one of the most popular characters for that reason. So let's talk about his skills. It'll give you some tips for each one. So his passive is 6 stents. This allows you to cheat death a single time. What that means is that there is a little icon underneath Wylder's health bar, which is his head with like a little like star above his head. When that icon is present underneath your health bar, that means that you have this cheat death active. So you can then cheat death once. Essentially, when you take damage that will knock you down, you'll do like this backstep animation and trigger this instead. This can only trigger once per side of grace rest. So you can have this trigger multiple times throughout each run, but it can only happen once per side of grace rest when you like go through a side of grace and you get like your flask and everything refreshed. This ability is part of what makes Wylder so good for solo play, even though solo is definitely very difficult in Elden Ring Nightreign, but it does allow you to make a little bit more mistakes, even though totally none of us have ever made a single mistake in a Souls game, right? We're all professional Souls players, but if you do make a mistake, it can cheat death that one time just to keep you in the fight. His skill Clawshot is fantastic. You can use this to hit smaller enemies to pull them towards you. You can use it on larger enemies to pull yourself towards those larger enemies, and you can actually use it on the environment to pull yourself around the environment as well. Now, something to note about this ability is it's pretty okay as its default form just as Clawshot, right? You know, you can use it to manipulate enemies. It will stagger them a little bit. If you hit an enemy that has a shield, it'll like stagger them out of them, like holding their shield. So it does have a lot of flexibility in the movement and a slight damage ability, but realistically, you really do want to make sure you have a relic active that gives you the benefit that allows you to have that follow-up attack where it adds fire to the weapon, which increases the damage it does, while also having this very high stance breaking follow-up attack. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Onslaught Stake is his ultimate. This is a very strong single attack that launches an iron stake with a great explosion. Something to note about this is that this can be charged, unlike a lot of the other ultimates in the game, and it will actually impact its overall damage. The default version, where you just press it, the animation is a lot shorter, and Wylder will just shoot the stake directly in front of him. If you hold this down, he will wind it up and shoot it above him. So this will increase its overall damage. It also increases the amount of invincibility frames that you have while you are charging this attack up. And this can be buffed to have like a molten lava effect on the ground with your relics as well. So another great benefit to using this. But I would highly recommend to charge this up. If you just use the uncharged version, it'll only use half of your ultimate charge compared to the full ultimate charge if you do charge it, but it does charge relatively quickly, and the extra damage plus the extra stance break potential is more beneficial to actually charging this up. For your overall runs with Wylder and what you should be focusing on, like, you can use anything, absolutely, but because of the relic that allows you to get that follow-up attack with your character skill, and because there are so many great swords in the game and so many like legendary ones as well, I do kind of highly recommend that you lean into great swords. They balance really well with strength, which is great for Wylder. A lot of them all have solid physical damage, plus, you know, depending on the boss you're fighting, you can match a weakness. Say if you're fighting a boss that's weak to holy, there's plenty of those, or magic, there's plenty of those that you'll be able to grab on your various runs. I've often dual wielded greatswords and then used the jump attack with both of them quite often, while having the stronger greatsword in my main hand, so that when I do use claw shot and have that follow-up animation, it does deal the most amount of damage possible. But you could say run a greatsword in your main hand, run a seal, a staff, a shield, anything you like in that offhand. But I've typically always lent away from the buckler parry as the run sort of start, because Wylder's greatsword is fantastic and you can buff it with your relics as well. But then the buckler parry, I've just never really been a parry guy in Elden Ring, and I've always just found it's better to then just immediately two-hand Wylder's weapon and then lean into those greatswords for as far as you can get, and hopefully get some better greatswords along the way. For those secondary effects, for all of your other weapon slots, look for things that, you know, increase your overall like physical attack power, or a certain attack power. Say you're using a lightning weapon, something that increases lightning attack power, or things that increase your overall attack power when you're, say, two-handing a greatsword, or when you have two armaments equipped, things like that. Really, attack power is the main thing you want to focus on, as he is a bit more offensively inclined, but you can definitely run a defensive Wylder if that's the option. Say if you find shields and you want to lean into guard counter, that's totally fine as well. For your relics, there's a few options here. The first thing I would recommend to do any Wylder player is to do the remembrances as fast as possible, not only because you get the slate whetstone, which is a fantastic relic that gives you that Wylder skill to follow up on greatswords that we were just talking about, but it also gives you the Wylder chalice, which has the third slot as a white slot relic, which means you can put any color relic in there, which just gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what relics you have equipped. Now, because, you know, relics are random, I can't tell you exactly what relics to find and what relics to equip, but definitely you do want to have that slate whetstone equipped because of the follow-up attacks. With the claw shot, I would be looking for things like there is the Wylder skill benefit as well, that you can actually purchase this one from the vendor, that on art activation spread fire to the ground. In order for this relic to show up at the jar vendor at the round table hold, you will have needed to defeat 4 bosses, and then you'll get this extra tier of relics that'll show up there, and you'll be able to purchase that from him. And then otherwise, in terms of your random relics, just look for things that increase your overall strength. Physical attack power ups are pretty good, or anything that does effects while you are using a great sword to really lean into that aspect of Wylder's kit is really what you're looking for. As I progressed with Wylder, I ended up switching back to his basic urn with the 2 red relic slots for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we'll talk about the remembrance relic that Wylder now gets. After you've beaten a total of 4 Night Lords, you'll unlock that chapter 7, which is the last like major step for Wylder. Now, this remembrance will require you to get a silver tier from Limveld. This is in the Noxtella City Shifted Earth. To get here, you need to follow this path that I am speeding through now. And once you get there, there'll be a troll. You need to defeat that troll, and then you'll be able to collect the silver tier, and then you can, you know, wipe that run or finish it, whatever you feel like doing, and you'll get the silver tier at the end. Now, while this relic does seem like it's quite powerful, right? So art gauge greatly filled when ability is activated. Ability is your passive ability. It's not using claw shot. So that's whenever Wylder gets that Sixth Sense effect active, where you just like happen to survive a death. That is when this will activate. Now, Arcane also isn't that good for Wylder unless you're running a status build, and then Ultimate Gauge just makes it generate a bit faster. Now, the Grand Burning Scene that we touched on earlier is also a red relic that gives you strength and dexterity, plus art activation spreads fire on the ground. That 2 strength and dex is an increase of about 4 attack rating per attack, roughly, maybe a bit more depending on the scaling of the weapon you're using, but with the default weapon, that's what it works out to be. And then I've just gotten like really lucky with my Wylder relics. Like I've got a relic that gives me an additional charge of claw shot. So I have 2 charges, which means I can use it very effectively as a movement skill, which by the way, if you don't know, you can just use claw shot on anything. And if you are in that like storm sprint, if you jump towards the end of the claw shot effect, you'll like launch yourself forward for extra movement speed. And then I've just got like a fantastic other red relic that has the follow-up attack possible when using character skill, plus improves greatsword attack power and dexterity +2, like just absolutely like god tier relic roll. So that's why I'm not using the silver tier, but you totally probably could. I just think that there are some better options or alternatives you could do. But also don't be afraid to try things that say add a status effect, like say poison, for example, onto your base weapon, because there's a lot of value in Wylder's greatsword. Unlike some of the other Nightfarers, you can still use this greatsword throughout most of the playthrough because you're leaning into that claw shot ability or anything, or even just having this in your offhand, right? So if you find one really strong greatsword, you can then upgrade Wylder's greatsword, have it in your offhand as that secondary equipped greatsword. Plenty of options there as well. A couple of tips for Wylder to close us out. I did mention it earlier, definitely charge that ultimate. As I mentioned earlier as well, the strength of Wylder is his flexibility in terms of what weapons you're using and the overall playstyle for each run, which also makes him fun because you're never really locked into, say, for example, using Ironeye here, right? You're always looking for a bow and a better bow. Whereas Wylder, anything that you find, you've got value in it because you might find some random legendary weapon that you're like, oh, that's this what I'm going to use for this run. And because of his flexibility, you can actually do that. But that is also why with Wylder, I recommend leaning into the weaknesses that these bosses have. For example, when you're looking at the bosses on the expedition screen, you can see what their weaknesses are. Because of his flexibility in terms of being able to use basically any weapon that he finds, you definitely want to be hunting these specific areas on the map that have those weaknesses, trying to find weapons that match with those bosses' weaknesses, because matching boss weaknesses in Nightreign is one of the best things you can do for these really difficult Night Lords as you get further into the game. And Wylder's flexibility does make that a little bit easier than some of the others when using Ironeye as an example. Again, I do like Ironeye, he's one of my favorite characters, so don't get me wrong, but when you're only looking for bows, it's very difficult to find a bow that has that exact status effect or that exact damage type you're looking for. Whereas here, when you've got the entire kit available to you of any sort of weapon, melee weapon range, whatever, it does make that a little bit nicer. So the playstyle for the Raider really revolves around using those heavy weapons. Because of the Raider's high HP and extremely high strength, he's very offensive focused compared to, say, the Guardian as his counterpart in terms of this strength and HP combo. The Guardian's much more defensive focused. The weapon preferences for the Raider is the Great Axe, the Great Hammer, and Colossal weapons, which means that you'll find these weapons much more regularly from like boss rewards while you're out exploring on expeditions. The Raider starts with the Raider's Great Axe that has Endure as its skill, but you probably won't really use it much. But because of your high poise and that Colossal weapon, you can expect to be regularly staggering enemies out of their standard attacks, just generally wreaking havoc. The Raider is best used as a frontline melee attacker. Typically, you want bosses to be attacking you so that you can charge your Retaliate skill, but you also need to be comfortable with walking in the fine line between like tanking damage into your health bar to charge that Retaliate, but not taking too much to, get yourself knocked down. So managing that damage you're taking and then still attacking through it with that high poise is part of understanding the Raider's kit. Now, your attributes here, you start with A for your HP, D for FP, which you never really will use, and A for stamina, S for strength. Then the others, it doesn't really matter. It's all about that HP, that stamina, and that strength. Let's break down the Raider's skills, starting with the passive, which is Fighter's Resolve. So taking damage boosts Retaliate's potency, and you cannot be knocked down whilst using it. This also has an additional effect to remain standing with a sliver of HP even after tanking a heavy damage. Now, this isn't like a survive death like Wylder has, where he can cheat death that one time. Essentially here, if you're in the Retaliate animation and an attack would kill you, it will keep you alive, but you'll only survive with like the tiniest little bit of health. This doesn't trigger very often. Like, it's not something I would be relying on to keep yourself alive. It's just more like a happenstance that it may happen. The real benefit is actually the damage increase you get from that Retaliate potency. So essentially what this means is you have to take damage, and eventually you'll see like this wind effect like occur around you, and there's a little sound that happens at the same time. When you see this and you've got sort of that like wind particles around you, your Retaliate is actually charged. This will then do a stronger version of that has a much longer wind up time, but a much larger amount of damage, as well as stagger, and can actually stagger any of the larger bosses and enemies in the world. So what Retaliate actually is you assume a tack stance and like guard yourself, and then you pummel forward. The standard version of this, while it will stagger enemies and still do a decent amount of damage, it's not as strong as the enhanced version once you have taken damage. But that shouldn't stop you from using like the normal version, as this skill does charge quite quickly, and with the right relics, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you can overall increase your attack power and your stamina when you are using Retaliate. Now, something to note as well is that you should absolutely use this when you have an enemy attacking you, because it can charge while you're in the middle of the animation, but you can't use Retaliate to get out of grab attacks. If you see like the blue particle effects of an enemy doing a grab attack, don't retaliate, because they're still going to eat you up. The ultimate is Totem Stellar. Now, you drive a Gravekeeper's Wedge into the earth to summon a giant tombstone. This tombstone radiates a protective aura, boosting the strength or the attack power of all nearby allies. It does do a little bit of damage when that totem does spawn and stagger enemies briefly, but it's not really the key focus. The main thing is about that additional buffs that you get from having this active. It does last about 30 seconds, and it can be buffed a little bit further with your relics as well. Something to note about this that's a little unique is those statues that you see in the world, you can actually break them with the Totem Stellar to get the rewards inside, but they're never really worth it. So I don't know if I'd be wasting my ultimate for that unless you're very early in your run. Speaking of your runs, you should be aiming for a heavy weapon. Now, you could dual wield, say, 2 colossal weapons, 2 great hammers, great axes, whatever. But because of your high strength, two-handing something is often better because it will improve your overall attack power with that one weapon. You can run a shield and a weapon combo, but like guard countering builds are really the Guardian's thing. So if that is the route you want to go, I would probably focus on the Guardian. But because of his weapon preferences, you'll get a ton of these colossal weapons and great weapons that just have these insane raw damage numbers. That is definitely the way to go. So once you've found that colossal weapon, whatever it is that you really like, you want to focus on just keeping that weapon as your main weapon, and then heavily focus on getting passive buffs. The passive buffs are very crucial for the Raider because, as mentioned, you want to take damage. So anything that increases your HP, your physical damage negation, increases your resistances to ailments, increases your poise, increases your stamina to a lesser degree, but is also beneficial because these heavy weapons we're using do consume a lot of stamina. Those are the buffs you want to focus on finding when you do get those boss rewards, especially once you've found that main weapon. That's what you should be focusing on. And due to Retaliate, for all of your other weapon slots and their passives, anything that increases your damage while two-handing a weapon is fantastic. Physical attack power, skill power less so depending on the weapon that you've got, but anything that really improves the overall effectiveness of the weapon you are using. So if you're using a fire weapon, fire attack power, etc., definitely the things to look out for. When you're picking your relics for the Raider, a couple of things to think about, namely is how easy it is to just get really good relics. Because of the Raider's remembrance, these are all solo boss fights that are pretty easy to clear, and you get access to his unique relics very quickly just by doing a couple of runs with the Raider and doing those remembrances on your own. Now, the first one you get is the Torn Braided Cord. So as the Raider, damage taken while using character skill improves attack power and stamina. Just fantastic combo because you're going to be using Retaliate all the time, plus you get a bonus to your strength, so just increasing your overall physical damage. And at the end of your remembrance, once you have completed it, you get access to the Black Claw Necklace. Defeating enemies near Totem Stellar restores HP. I've seen this on other relics as well, so you don't need to necessarily complete the remembrance in order to get that specific effect, but it is also very beneficial. It does also come with additional poise. For other relics and just like the general random ones, really you're looking for things that increase your overall strength, your physical attack power, your HP, and your vigor. Stamina is also beneficial, but less so. Poise is good as well. Everything about the Raider is that raw physical attack power and his strength. So as far as you can push that, as high as you can push that, is exactly what you should be looking for in terms of his relics. And the basic chalice with Raider is actually completely fine to use as it combos perfectly with the uniques that you get. So nothing really to focus on in terms of like finding that right combination for the Raider. He's quite simple across the board. Some tips for playing Raider and best party combos. I would really say that having an Ironeye or Recluse with Raider is quite beneficial. Characters that he can protect in a pinch that don't necessarily want to be attacked directly. They can also res him from range, which is really beneficial because, you know, you will go down maybe slightly more regularly than some of the other Nightfarers because you're teetering on that line of taking damage sometimes, and sometimes you can take too much. His ultimate, while doesn't directly res allies when they have more more than like 1 pip of that res health, you can use it to separate yourself from the boss because it is that giant tombstone. So you can get that separation to easily res, or say sometimes you can actually, if you get it in the right location, you can put them on top of the platform when they're down so you can easily res them while you're up there. Generally speaking though, the Raider isn't really a very complex character. It's a great character to grab early in your experience in Elden Ring Nightreign, especially if you like these colossal weapon Unga Bunga builds that you can just grab one giant weapon and swing it like mad. That's really what is beneficial about the Raider's kit, is there's not a lot of complexity in terms of things you have to learn. He has quite a simple kit overall that's very easy to learn if you have played Elden Ring and just understand how it works because of his supportive ultimate, but then also retaliate, which you should be using quite regularly. Like even if it's not in that charged variant, it doesn't necessarily matter that much. Like sometimes you might want to use it just to get a little bit of damage off or get a little bit of stagger, because it does have a high chance of stance breaking, especially the charge variant, obviously. But it's also fantastic to use if you have the charge variant on like enemy bosses when they're in those like big heavy attacks to briefly stagger them, that you can break them out of it. So very beneficial attack, and just overall a fun character that if you like taking damage, you like smacking enemies with giant weapons with maximum amounts of damage, very beneficial. The Executor fills quite an interesting role in Elden Ring Nightreign. We have the HP and the stamina and skills to basically play as that frontline melee character, that tanking sort of role with the deflecting capabilities of the Sekiro-like parry with the Cursed Sword skill, but also you've got the highest arcane and dexterity attribute scaling of any of the starting NIGHTFARERs. So this is a perfect class for any katana or dex wielding build, plus status effects especially. The Executor is very high risk, high reward in that you have to master the Sacred Sword's parrying ability to get the most value out of his kit. However, learning those parry times is going to see you tank a lot of hits just to your face, which can be tricky because you don't have enough HP to take too many of those hits. And because of this, I would say that the Executor isn't one of the NIGHTFARERs I would recommend starting out with in Elden Ring Nightreign, especially if you don't have that Elden Ring original knowledge. Like learning all of the boss attacks and their animations and when those timings are will absolutely see you have massive success with this character, but you've got to learn those timings first. Attribute-wise, you do start out with B HP, D FP, B Stamina, C Strength, and D Intelligence, and D Faith. But the two main ones here are Dexterity and Arcane, both being S. This means that status effects like Bleed, Frostbite, Poison, Scarlet Rot, all that stuff will absolutely build up very, very fast with the Executor, but also weapons like the Katana, which is their preferred weapon, so you'll see them spawn quite regularly, are absolutely beneficial for the Executor to use, things like daggers as well. Something to note about the Executor is that their main weakness is groups of enemies, and it's an interesting push and pull because in a 1v1 situation, they absolutely excel because of the Cursed Blade and how you can sort of stand your ground, deflect those attacks, break enemy stances, and follow up with critical hits. But in group scenarios, you can't really deflect every single enemy, so it's a lot harder to see that success, which is actually where the ultimate comes into play. So speaking of those skills, the passive ability is Tenacity, which you will receive a boost after recovering from a status ailment. That boost will increase your attack and your stamina recovery speed for a period of time. This buff only occurs when that status effect has stopped occurring on you. For status effects like blood loss or madness that completely remove as soon as they apply, you'll just get that effect immediately. But for things like poison, scarlet rot, and frostbite, you'll have to wait for that status ailment bar to completely drain before you get those benefits. Very rarely will you ever actively seek to trigger out this passive because you can't really force yourself to get status effects, and often that's a bad thing to do. The only time that you would really be seeking it out manually is if, say, you have a weapon that has seppuku on it, or if you find a relic that can put that on your starting katana, things like that is only the real time you would be using it yourself, but occasionally this will trigger and you get benefits from it happening anyway. The character skill is the main part of the Executor's kit, being Cursed Sword, which will draw the Cursed Sword that can deflect enemy attacks. Now, by repeatedly deflecting attacks, you will power up the Cursed Sword to essentially enchant the weapon, and then you can then follow up by using the weapon skill that with an attack that will lunge you forward and slice through the enemy for very high damage and stance damage. This will deplete the sword's charge and you need to charge it up again. While the sword is charged, it will deal additional damage with its just standard light and heavy attacks, and you can actually bank that charged sword, so you can charge it up and then put it away and save that charge charged Cursed Sword Slash for a later time. Now, something to note is that you can't deflect grab attacks, but you can deflect projectiles and spells, which is definitely worth doing. And you will build up stance damage when you're just deflecting attacks, similar to Sakura. You don't have to actually attack the enemy to build up that stance. Just deflecting will build up that stance damage for you to follow up with a critical hit. Now, the ultimate ability here is called Aspects of the Crucible Beast. This assumes the form of a primordial beast. Now, this beast has a full suite of attacks, and you should be using all of them. So what you've got here is a light and a heavy attack bound to your typical light and heavy attacks, which you can use. You've also got a raw bound to your L1, which is a much more AoE focused attack that'll hit basically everything as you project that raw in front of you. This can be buffed with your relics as well. More on that in a little bit. But the main thing to think about here is that you've also got a weapon skill, which is your L2 button, as it always is. This will charge up like this claw attack and you'll sweep down. This is the highest damage attack that the beast form can do. Now, when you are in beast form, your ultimate gauge, you'll notice, will slowly deplete as you're just in the form and using these attacks. What you should be doing is using your light, your heavy attacks, and that raw a couple of times, watching that ability bar. And then when you get close to that ultimate gauge being completely gone, you want to build up that weapon skill and then slash down for that massive amount of damage it can do. Most of the Executor players I have seen just spam light and heavy attacks. They don't use raw, and they definitely don't use that weapon skill. You should be using that weapon skill to finish off your beast form every single time. It does the most damage while you're in that form, and you're absolutely not getting the best out of that form if you aren't using it. One other thing to note about the beast form is that it is fantastic for survivability. It gives you a massive HP boost when you're in the form, and it will refill any of the missing HP from your normal health bar. When you exit that form, you'll keep whatever that HP was, except for the additional bonus, like additional bar that you get, right? But keep in mind, you can actually die in the beast form. It doesn't make you immune to damage or anything like that. You can absolutely die in this form, so do be mindful of that. All right, when you're out on the runs, a couple of things you should be looking for, namely is katanas. You'll see heaps of these. Curved swords are also fantastic, but definitely anything that has status effects on it. Bleed is so strong for the Executor. You absolutely want to have that on your main weapon at least. And then things like poison, scarlet rot, frostbite, also fantastic, especially if you do see frostbite camps. If you do get lucky, which does happen a little bit because of that weapon preference being katana, you can get a katana that has bleed and frostbite on it, and then you're essentially just laughing. You've got two fantastic status effects that you can trigger on enemies as much as you like. Now, other things to look for just in terms of your passives and other rewards, stamina buffs are great for the Executor because of the stamina drain you get not only from swinging two weapons, which I do recommend to dual wield katanas or curved swords, but also from deflecting or blocking, because you will drain stamina while you're in the cursed sword form and trying to deflect shots, and then sometimes you won't actually get that deflect timing right, and it'll just be like a standard block which will eat through most of your stamina. So the more stamina and stamina recovery you have, the better. And then general attack buffs for wielding two armaments or anything specific to the attack power buffs that you're relevant to your current weapon setup are also very good. But you could also lean into a little bit of those guard passive bonuses as well, because you will do a bit of blocking when you're in the Sacred Sword. So there is a little bit of flexibility here, but really leaning into a two armament build with katanas or curved swords or something like that. But especially a dexterity weapon is what you should be looking for. Like, I know that sometimes these dexterity weapons don't always seem like they have the most overall damage, and that's outweighed by, say, like a colossal weapon or something that might drop for you. But ultimately, the speed of those attacks plus the status effect on them significantly outweigh the damage potential that this Nightfarer can do than just, say, hitting an enemy with a big Unga Bunga stick. The best relics for the Executor come down to a couple of things. Obviously, most of them come from their remembrance, as they always do. At step 3 of the remembrance for the Executor, you'll get the Blessed Flowers. While character skill is active, unlocking your cursed sword restores HP. So when you are deflecting, once you've charged the cursed blade, before you actually use it as like that, swing attack, just when you trigger that charge, you'll get some HP back. And then progressing the remembrance for the Executor, pretty simple overall. You just need to beat any Night Lord a couple of times, and you'll then progress to step 6, which is the big major one. This will have you go into Limveld on a personal objective objective to collect a golden sprout at the very top of the mountaintop shifting event. This is definitely best done on a multiplayer run because the mountaintop absolutely sucks, and you will know that if you have watched my mistakes to avoid video. But if you have done that, you'll then be able to go and get the golden sprout, bring that back, and you'll be able to complete the remembrance. And at the very end, which is the final step in the Executor's remembrance, you get the golden sprout, which gives you roaring, restores HP while art is active. So what that means is when you are in the beast form, by pressing L1 on the PlayStation controller or whatever it is on any device you are using, you will then restore HP, which is beneficial because it's very easy to die as the beast because you don't really have a lot of defenses. It can definitely help alleviate some of those concerns. And then it also gives you HP recovery for successful guarding and slowly restores HP of self and nearby allies when HP is low. But that HP on successful guarding is any deflects, you'll just get HP back. Absolutely fantastic. Otherwise, I do recommend to run anything that gives you improvements to your critical hits, as you'll do a whole lot of them because you've got a lot of stance break from the Sacred Sword. HP on guarding or other guard buffs is also good. Extra stamina can't see you wrong either, same as it does on your runs because you're going to be blocking and defending quite a lot. And then anything that is related to, say, blood loss or status effects or katana related is obviously beneficial. And then worst comes to worst, any dexterity or arcane increases are also absolutely fantastic. A couple of tips for the Executor or the Executor, whatever you want to call it. Now, the Sacred Sword and the Beast form is actually quite interesting to think about when you play this Nightfarer. So if you're facing an enemy 1v1, you really want to use that Sacred Sword, deflect those attacks, just swing that weapon around and focus on that enemy holistically. When you're in group scenarios, the Beast aspect of the Crucible form is really exceptional to clear those trash enemies and also keep you safe because it can be quite difficult to deal with those large enemies, especially in solo runs. Like the Executor is good in solo runs when you're fighting things 1v1, but they do struggle in group scenarios, which is where that Beast form really, really helps. Also, just to give you a free heal for survivability, like say you could be fighting a boss or anything like that. Maybe you don't want to use that flask, like you want to keep it because you're only missing a little bit of health. If you've got your ultimate available, using that to refill your health bar and then also to melt down as much damage as you can do is quite a beneficial tactic as well. The Beast form also isn't a bad revive tool because often you can hit the enemy or the boss as well as hitting your ally to revive them. Plus you've got that additional HP so you can survive a little bit longer than say if you just run up to them and smack them around with your katana, which typically you'll always run out of stamina as you often do when you do sprint up to revive allies. So I was pretty harsh on the Guardian in the intro, but he is actually a fantastic character. He has the highest starting HP and a heavily shield-focused Nightfarer, but unlike the Raider that has similar starting stats to the Guardian, they both have high strength and high HP. The Raider is significantly more offensive focused and simply about taking damage into their health for that retaliate skill or using, say, colossal weapons with very high amounts of poise, whereas the Guardian is all about defensive capabilities and taking damage into your shield via your stamina and then using the Steel Guard passive to minimize the impact of those hits. The Guardian excels for any player that really likes to guard counter, critical hits, use shields, absolutely loves halberds as that's the Guardian's preferred weapon, so you'll definitely find a lot of halberds while you're out exploring. Something to note about the Guardian, however, is that there is a distinct lack of mobility and FP with the Guardian. This means that quicker moving bosses or flying enemies can be very tricky for the Guardian to deal with, and this particularly is very beneficial for the Guardian to have either an Ironeye or a Recluse, a ranged character in their party, just to help offset that issue. For the attributes for the Guardian, you start out with S HP, C FP, A stamina, B strength, and then C across the boards for the rest except intelligence D. So realistically, strength-based weapons should be your focus here along with a shield to compare. So for your skills, starting out with the passive, we have Steel Guard. You plant your feet and brace with a shield for a more powerful guard. In order to trigger this guard effect, you need to hold down the guard button and then press the dodge button while flicking the left stick in any direction, and you'll move into like a deeper guarding stance. You can easily tell when the Guardian's in this because he sort of like locks himself down to like a much slower stance, and you can move much slower while you're in this stance compared to like typical gardening. You'll definitely know when you're in it. It greatly increases your guard boost, but prevents you from running or really moving anywhere. And that's where a lot of the movement issues come from the Guardian, is you're going to be in this stance quite regularly. While you're in this stance, it does drain your stamina anytime you take hits into your shield, and just generally it will drain your stamina. Now this will block anything except for grab attacks and larger AoEs. Just keep that in mind, that you can't steal guard past grab attacks, as you'll still get eaten up. I learned that out the hard way. Whirlwind is the skill to beat your wings to whip up a wind churning cyclone. The length of this is quite, in terms of duration, is quite short, but it can be charged to enlarge its radius, and with the right skills you can actually make this last significantly longer. And for smaller enemies, you can essentially just lock them in a stagger animation while they're inside it, which makes it very beneficial, especially when you do charge it for that larger radius while you're just farming all the trash enemies and like the smaller bosses. It's a really powerful skill. It's less powerful for bosses because it's really only in those cases just really used for the chip damage that it's doing, which isn't, you know, nothing to sneeze at. Any damage is good damage. But in some of the fights against the Night Lords, and they're moving around a lot because of the stationary nature of this ability and the wind up time to like charge it, and enemies are just going to move out of it anyway. Not something you'll typically use a lot in larger boss encounters. The ultimate, Wings of Salvation, is one you'll definitely be using in boss encounters. You leap up in the air and you dive back down, raising a protective area. Something to note about this ultimate is that in my experience so far, I often see it used as a damaging ability. It does do decent damage, don't get me wrong, but the benefit and the real value out of Guardian isn't from the damage it does. One, if you use this ability, it's a great repositioning tool, as you can reposition yourself up in the air and slam yourself down. It has an additional effect that it will revive allies unless they're like pips, they've got like completely maxed out with all three. It will revive them unless it's not completely maxed out. So it's basically a free revive mechanic, and because you're immune during this animation, you can easily trigger this effect and get this off, land yourself up in the air, deal some decent damage, and revive your allies. That's the main way you should be using it. However, something to note is that this can also be charged. Now, if you hold down the ultimate using ability during that entire animation, when you slam back down on the ground, you can stay in that animation. When you have landed and you're in that spot, you're immune from damage and you're immobile. So you can't take damage while you're in that sphere. And what will happen is that enemy attacks will like rebound off you. Some of the larger attacks will still hit you, right? But just like standard weaker attacks won't. You'll be like stuck in that invulnerability state. When you're like this, you will actually give your allies a defensive buff while this is happening. This can be buffed as well to like say restore HP with certain relics as well. So there's a lot of benefits to this skill from a supporting perspective, less so from a damaging perspective, though it does do some fantastic damage. So think about it as that use as being able to revive allies, then hold it down so that they can get a little bit of health back. They get that defense. They can sort of set themselves to get back into the fight before you jump back up and join them. The run progression for the Guardian, there's really two things that you should be on the lookout for, and then the rest is kind of passive bonuses. The two things you should be looking for is a better shield, or upgrade the shield you have, and a thrusting weapon. So in terms of the shield, right, like it doesn't really matter what shield you use. The starting shield with the Guardian is like completely fine to use, and just upgrade with a stone 1 and then a smithing stone 2 if you do go into the mines and grab one to upgrade it via that method. Realistically, it's just to increase that guard boost because you're not using it for anything else. It's just simply to block. So if you do find another shield, you can definitely switch to it. Something to note, by the way, about shields in Elden Ring Nightreign is that unlike Elden Ring, all the shields here have 100 physical damage negation. So they will all completely block any physical damage that you are taking. They all have various stats in terms of the other types of damaging effects, which you can view at the training grounds or looking at all the shields. But because they have 100% physical damage negation, the key stat to pay attention to is that guard boost. The higher the guard boost, the less stamina you will use when you're blocking with that shield in steel guard, and vice versa when you're just simply blocking. So typically you want a great shield here because they have a higher guard boost, but regardless of what shield it is, it may have like a status effect on it. Like I did have a good run with the ant shield that has like the poison status effect on it, so I was applying poison with that. Realistically, it doesn't matter as long as it's got good guard boost and a decent shield. You definitely want to be using it, and I do recommend to always use a shield here because you just lose half of the value of the reason you're running Guardian if you aren't running a shield. Like if you're just going to like two-hand a halberd or, you know, use a colossal weapon, whatever, you may as well play Raider. The reason you play this character is for the shield benefits as well as the guard countering. Now, the other aspect of this is looking for a piercing weapon. That can be a halberd, that can be a spear, a great spear, whatever it is, but you want a piercing weapon so that you can hold your shield active in block or with steel guard active and be able to poke through it so you can still deal damage in that way. And then outside of that, realistically, you want to find as many bonuses like passive buffs to your stamina as possible, because you're going to be eating through that stamina very quickly while you're holding up your shield and while you're poking through it. The more stamina you have, the longer you can tank that damage into your stamina. And then HP and poise is still pretty solid as well. And then for your weapon passives, you're either looking for things that improve your guard countering or your blocking bonuses. Things like that is the overall kit that you want for the Guardian. Secondarily though, warming stones are actually very useful for the Guardian because you're often very stationary here, standing in one spot. Dropping a warming stone on your feet, which will just give you HP regeneration, definitely valuable. Same with running incantations that add effects to the ground. Like, there are holy incantations that will activate an effect on the ground that you can simply stand in, similar to the warming stone. So those kind of seals, if you find ones that have those effects, they're not too bad. But for the most part here, you're really just looking for a shield and a piercing weapon, typically a halberd. The best relics for the Guardian mostly come from his remembrances, so we'll completely go through that in a moment. But firstly, go to the jar vendor and grab the polished drizzling scene. This has draw enemy attention while guarding on it. It's a fantastic relic to run for your Guardian early in your Guardian's experience while you're still working through the remembrances, because you want to be drawing that attention as the Guardian. You want enemies to be attacking you. This can absolutely help with that. Plus the vigor to increase your HP isn't bad. The best relic though, just overall for the Guardian, is the stone stake, which you get as the first relic unlock from the remembrance for the Guardian at 3. And in order to do this, you simply need to kill the Guardian in Limveld. You can do this solo. I did this solo. It's very easy to go run in there and kill the golem in just a run. Like, just level yourself up a little bit and then go fight the golem. And then all you have to do at the end of that run is just simply die to the Night Lord. It'll fail the run, but you'll still get to keep the stone stake to go back to your remembrances. Now, once you've unlocked this, it does increase the duration of the character skill of Whirlwind. This is how I was talking about earlier in the video, that Whirlwind can last an extremely long time, especially when charged. It's just so beneficial. Like, you can see the difference here in terms of when you have this active and when you don't. When you don't have it active, Whirlwind lasts like a second. When you have it active, it's like 4 to 5. Like, it's so much longer, so much more beneficial to have it. Plus the second effect on this reduces the cooldown by +3. So you can just constantly spam it and it lasts so long. It's just extremely beneficial. At Remembrance step 6 here, you get the Guardian Chalice, which is that additional chalice you can get that has the white relic slot. This will then allow you to equip any of your relics in that white slot. So it's definitely the best chalice to run for the Guardian. Now, at the next step after that, at I believe it's step 8, you will then need to return to Limveld and talk to the demon vendor and ask him for a tome. This tome costs you 10,000 runes. You can absolutely do this solo again. This creates a whirlwind while charging your halberd attacks. Because this is red, just like the stone stake, I have lent stone stake because it's just kind of better because of whirlwind's length of how long it lasts. But if you prefer, you could run the third volume instead. After this point, as you get onto the last step, for the Guardian, you'll get the Witch's Brooch, which is a fantastic blue relic that the Guardian slowly restores nearby allies' HP while the art is active. That's again how I was talking about earlier with the Wings of Salvation ultimate. While you're holding it active to land yourself on the ground, you're holding it to buff your allies. Their HP will restore in that animation, and you will reflect a portion of damage received when an ability is activated as well as the Guardian. So both are really beneficial, and the Guardian's remembrances overall pretty easy to do. Simply to progress it, if you're at a step that isn't like a remembrance you can enter, all you need to do is defeat a Night Lord as the Guardian. You'll progress to the next step. It's a very easy remembrance to do, and one you should absolutely focus on very early if you are playing as the Guardian, because the benefits of these relics are just so strong. Otherwise, for relics, you're really looking for things that increase, say, your critical hit, your guard boost, your guard countering abilities, endurance and stamina, also beneficial. Plus anything that buffs your allies can definitely go quite a long way because of how supportive the Guardian is focused. A couple of tips for playing as the Guardian. I would recommend to hold your shield as often as possible and use those piercing weapons. You could absolutely run something else if you wanted to, but simply just running around, holding your shield, blocking all the damage into it, hoping that enemies are attacking you so you can tank those hits is beneficial. But ultimately, really, there isn't a lot to say about the Guardian. He's a pretty simple kit to get used to, especially if you liked using shields in Elden Ring. It's just that understanding that you need to hold the shield button and then dodge to enter Steel Guard, which makes your guarding so much more beneficial, but it does slow your movement speed so much. So comboing this with with an Ironeye, Recluse are really good, as well as say even something like a Duchess is pretty handy here because of the status effects. They can help alleviate the lack of damage that the Guardian often has by offsetting it with status effects that they can apply and using the restage ability to apply them again. A lot of synergies with both the ranged characters and someone like a Duchess to run with the Guardian. Recluse is the dedicated spellcaster of Nightreign, but that spellcasting goes a little bit further than sorceries. One of the lesser known parts of her kit that I don't see a lot of people utilizing as much as they should is that Faith is also at S scaling for Recluse. So speaking of those attributes, she has S Faith and S Intelligence scaling, which is the highest for both. Now she also has FP at A scaling, D HP, C Stamina, D Strength, C Dexterity, and C Arcane. So what that tells you based on those stats is that all those Recluse players that you see out there that are using a staff with a weapon in their other hand like a battle mage, that's not really Recluse's strength. That's actually Duchess's strength if you know how to use her properly. So what this really means is that you have both sorceries and incantations available to you. And in a lot of cases as Recluse, you should be dual wielding a seal in one hand and a staff in the other. So you've got access to that wide range of spells so you can maximize the amount of damage you're doing as well as use the magic cocktail to its maximum effectiveness. Now, one of the major strengths of Recluse is her passive ability that allows her to regenerate FP. So you'll always have enough FP to cast, unlike the Revenant, which doesn't have that capability. So that's why it's much better to dual wield sorceries and incantations rather than using a melee weapon, because you never really need to. If you are using a melee weapon as Recluse, you've probably done something wrong, to be honest, because you should always be able to generate enough FP so you can constantly be casting spells. All right, let's talk about those skills, starting with the passive, Elemental Defense. Now, discover affinities, residues that can be collected to replenish FP. Essentially what that means is anytime there is some sort of an elemental effect on the enemy or even sometimes on your allies, you will be able to draw that residue in, which will restore your FP and add 1 charge to your magic cocktail. The type of residue that you draw in is actually the type of element that the enemy was last afflicted by. That could be magic, fire, lightning, or holy. Now, another way that you can generate these residues is actually with elemental pots, by the way. So fire pots, magic pots, etc. If you use these, this will actually create a residue on the target as well. So there's another way to do this without just having to use your own spells. And also your allies can generate them as well. If they're using a fire weapon, there'll then be a fire residue on that enemy that you'll be able to draw from. So the magic cocktail is the core part of the Recluse's kit that is quite complex, as there is so many different ways that this cocktail can be created. So once you have drawn in 3 residues, you'll have a magic cocktail for you to cast. Now this spell will be different depending on the residues that you drew in. So firstly, before we go through the list, and we're going to go through the full list, you can actually see exactly what all of these are in the game. In the handbook section, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll be able to see the magic cocktail combinations if you ever want to refer to them. But we'll go through every single one here, starting with the single variant. So what that means is that you're using a pure elemental residue. So for example, as pure magic, when you've drawn in 3 magic, you'll enwreath an enemy in magic that deals damage for some time, encircling and attacking the target. Pure fire throws a whirlwind of flame. Flames spread across a small area upon contact and burns for some time. Actually a really good single magic cocktail because of that like damage over time effect that does seem to last a bit longer and do a bit more damage than fire. Pure lightning enwreaths oneself in lightning, bolstering dodging actions. This gives you a unique dodge, kind of like a Bloodhound step in a way, but when you dodge, you'll become invisible for a second with that lightning effect and then spawn at that other side. So not really an offensive skill. Very rarely will you actually seek out to use pure lightning. Pure holy enwreath oneself in holy light, bolstering poise and increasing damage negation. Another one that you probably won't actively seek out to use very often unless you do desperately want that damage negation, but you can get that in sort of other ways. Typically you want to be leaning onto the pure magic or the pure fire in this section if you are using a lot of these single ones. The most common that you'll probably use is the magic cocktail doubles. What that is it's a 2 affinity residues of one type, for example 2 magic, and then 1 of a different type, for example equal 1 fire. Now, if you have, say, 2 fire and 1 magic, it does the exact same thing as if you have 2 magic and 1 fire. It's just that combination of having 2 rather than, say, 3 or 1. So speaking of magic and fire, when you have a magic and fire cocktail, you'll launch a wreath of flame that pursues enemies. Similar to the pure magic, it will wreath around them and deal damage over time. Magic and lightning combination will execute a broad forward slash with a magic blade, and you can hold to move with the sword drawn. So you can sort of adjust yourself a little bit as that sword push goes out. Magic and holy combination will cover nearby area with a magic veil, fully conserving FP for self and allies for a short time. And that short time, really short. Like it's maybe 5 seconds by the time you've actually cast the cocktail. You've got time for maybe 1 or 2 spells that you'll be able to cast for completely free FP cost. So if you've got a high FP cost spell, something like, say, Full Moon, you might want to use a magic and holy combination and then use that as a way of getting that spell off for free. The fire and lightning combination will make you a fireball and barrel forward and then rain down lightning on nearby foes. A solid attack, but also be mindful that because this does drive you forward into the fray, you can get hit from damage if you use fire and lightning quite a lot, because you'll just basically charge into the boss, which as a Recluse, you do want to keep your distance as much as possible. The fire and holy combination will raise a torch for a limited time that raises maximum HP, reducing status ailment gauge buildup for nearby allies and lowers maximum HP of nearby enemies. Quite a solid effect, mostly because it lowers the maximum HP of nearby enemies, but also fantastic for those bosses that do have a lot of status ailments. This is a fantastic one to use. Lightning and Holy is the last of the double cocktails. What this will do is weave a layer of lightning that parries enemy attacks for a short time. Not really very useful and not one I would recommend. Essentially, this will just create like a barrier in front of you that will just automatically parry attacks. Great for stance damage, pretty good for solo play if you're playing as a solo Recluse. Realistically, not something you'll be using because you don't really want enemies attacking you directly as Recluse, so you probably won't lean onto that too much. Now, the last variant of the magic cocktail is just simply called mixed, and this is when you have 3 different affinity types. So each one of the 3 different residues you've drawn are from a different element. So firstly, the magic, fire, and lightning combination. Conjure frontwards exploding gravity orb, and that gravity orb pulls enemies inward, expands, and explodes, inflicting heavy damage. This combination is the highest damage potential that you can do as Recluse for her magic cocktail, dealing the most damage in an immediate effect. Well worth trying to trigger this regularly, especially on Night Lords and difficult bosses, because of the amount of damage potential it can do. The magic, fire, and holy combination, you spew a mixed affinity breath that inflicts damage upon enemies and restores HP and FP of allies with contact. Also a fantastic combination to help your allies and support them by increasing their HP and FP when you do make contact. Fire, lightning, and holy combination will create a lightning rod that thrusts forward into terrain while lightning strikes after a short delay. This is also fantastic damage output, but the downside is that that lightning rod sticks in place and you've got to hope the enemy is still there when that lightning rod triggers. So that's the only weakness there, but that damage potential is really good, especially against stationary enemies that don't move a whole lot. Magic, lightning, and holy combination will create a cold storm with area of effect and retreat inside an ice block, making you invulnerable. This can trigger frostbite, and it's an okay combination, except the downside is that while you're in that ice block, you're invulnerable, so you can't take damage, but you also can't do damage. You're essentially just stuck in that ice block until the effect ends. So not something I would use very regularly, but say the frostbite, and if you're fighting something that maybe you need those seconds of invulnerability, it's not a bad one to use either. So that's a list of all of the cocktails. Now you can come back and refer to this video and get that explanation at any other time, but you can also view this information in the game. Mastering how these cocktails work and understanding that they are all different will absolutely see you succeed as a Recluse player. Now, something to note is that you can see what cocktail you have active once you've got all 3 residues, because the icon will change to represent what cocktail will actually come out when you use it, as all the different cocktail variants that we just discussed have a different icon that will appear once you've collected 3 residues. And the ultimate ability is Soul Blood Song. This unleashes a forbidden blood chant to brand nearby foes with blood sigils. Those blood sigils, while they're active, will increase the damage taken of those enemies, and when hit by yourself or your allies, you will increase your HP and FP per hit. This is really good as a supportive ultimate, not something you will typically use at the very start of a combat encounter because you and your allies don't really need that HP and FP restoration, and that is the main effect that I would lean into with this ultimate. Not so much that increased damage, but say using it sometime in sort of the mid-fight when maybe the boss has just hit their phase 2, or you guys are really struggling, you need that extra HP. Maybe one of your allies has a weapon that has an amazing weapon skill, they've used all their FP and they need to get that back. It's a good combination with Revenant for that reason as well, but definitely a supportive ultimate, not something you'll just use to trigger any sort of fight starting. So the run progression for Recluse, there's really two things you should be looking out for, and it really comes down to staves, and obviously because of the intelligence-based sorceries that you can do, it's definitely the main focus here, but absolutely having a Sacred Seal, because Sacred Seals often have the fire and the lightning and the holy effects that we discussed earlier. So basically what you want to do is try and have a staff in one hand and a seal in the other so that you can create your own cocktails of whatever type that you personally want to use, as well as matching enemy weaknesses, because you'll then be able to deal basically every element type that you can do. You'll be able to maximize your damage output. So in order to find these, you do want to look for those seal huts that are often found near churches that drop a couple of seals. Not that they're going to be super overpowered, but at least it gives you some options in the seals in the early to mid game. And then also magic towers. The mage towers, fantastic to get because you typically will always get a staff at the very top, or at least some sort of an intelligence buff that are really beneficial for Recluse. The downside is that these are quite difficult to do. In order to complete them, you do need to find the magic seal that like blocks the entrance. Sometimes these are just simply not worth doing because you cannot find the seal for the life of you. It could be a tree that's simply run off and hidden somewhere, or it's like very well hidden. In that case, don't waste too much time trying to clear these mage towers, just move on. But if they are on your path, definitely worth doing as a Recluse in order to get yourself a better staff and maybe some other upgrades as well. Something to note about staves and seals, by the way, is that each type of seal or staff will always have the same spell bound to their light attack, with the heavy attack spell being random from the other pool of spells available. So you can get used to the different types of staves and seals when you're looking at them and looting them, and getting that knowledge will help you make those quick decisions when you're trying to loot, to know that that first spell is always the same and the second one is always random. So it's often not worthwhile, say, carrying two staves or seals of the same type unless that heavy spell is really good or it has really good passives, because for the most part that you're sort of doubling up. You're better off switching out the options and having multiple different types of staves or seals so you've got more options available to you. And then other than the weapons we're talking about, what you're really looking for is any weapon passives that have improved sorceries or improved charge sorceries, improved incantations, charge incantations. Those are the passives you're looking for, as that's really the relevant parts of the Recluse's kit. And then for any of your personal passives, anything that increases your FP or your FP regeneration is good, but also I wouldn't sneeze at anything that's like, say, HP or damage negation, as you do have very low HP. It's very easy to get one shot in the early game as Recluse, so having a little bit of extra HP or damage negation, if that's the only options you can take, definitely not too bad to grab. The best relics for Recluse. Firstly, we'll start with at the jar vendor. Once you've beaten, I believe it's 4 Night Lords, you can buy the Grand Tranquil Scene. Now this will suffer blood loss and increase attack power when your art activates. That is your ultimate, so you'll suffer blood loss, so you'll take a bit of damage, but you'll also increase your attack power. But it also has mind +2 and intelligence +2. Definitely worth grabbing, and it is yellow, which as you progress through Recluse's remembrance actually fits perfectly with the 2 remembrance relics. So the remembrance for Recluse is a little easy to do. It's not too bad. There's a couple of steps that we'll call out. At chapter 2, which is the first major step, which is actually where you get the chalice, you will need to do a personal objective in Limveld in the top northeast corner, where you'll need to defeat a golden hippo. And by doing so and going back to the roundtable hold afterwards, you will then be rewarded with Recluse's chalice, which is yellow and green with that additional white slot, which is the main one you want because you can put any relic in that slot. Now, these early stages of Recluse's remembrances are quite easy to progress. You simply just need to complete the next step and then move on to the next one. You might need to beat a Night Lord here and there, but they're quite easy to do. But at chapter 4, you'll obtain the Vestige of Night. Now, you'll just essentially need to enter here and complete the remembrance. It's not too tricky. This will give you Recluse containing affinity residues, activates Terra Magica. Absolutely insane benefits. So anytime you draw affinity residue, there's a chance that a Terra Magica will spawn underneath you, significantly increasing the power of your sorceries. So anytime you're standing in that and casting it, plus it has magic attack power up +2, really beneficial, and it is green, so it fits perfectly into the chalice that we were just discussing. Now to progress progress past chapter 5 of Recluse's Remembrance, you do need to beat 4 Night Lords in total, and then have at least beaten 1 while you've got on that step at Recluse to then progress to chapter 6, which is when you'll get the bone-like stone relic. But also this step can be a little bit tricky, so just to point out here, you need to find an imposter at the round table hold. This is actually the Iron Maiden that's found in the sparring grounds. You just need to attack that maiden a couple of times. The imposter will be revealed, and then you can progress to the end of the Remembrance, and you'll get the bone-like stone relic, which is another green relic, but you can just put this in the white slot of the chalice we were touching earlier. Now this comes with that suffer blood loss and increase attack power upon art activation, like I mentioned earlier, but it also comes with the Recluse specific effect to activating ultimate art raises max HP and intelligence +3. So when you use that ultimate art, you get a little bit of extra HP, just really beneficial for that. Definitely switch this out with that Grand Tranquil Scene if you can, but ultimately if you don't have a better option, I've just been using these 3 because I just simply haven't found a better option in like the random relics for Recluse. But really you're looking for things that increase your mind, your intelligence, your FP, magic damage, magic attack power, sorceries, incantations. They're the sort of random effects you're looking for, but this is the 3 combination I've been running because I just haven't found something better to replace in that yellow slot. Now to progress past chapter 7 of Recluse's Remembrance, by the way, you do need to beat the final Night Lord as Recluse. You don't need to have Remembrance active, you just need to beat them as Recluse. You'll get a different scene and everything, and you'll be able to experience it for yourself when you get there. A couple of tips for Recluse to close us out, and we'll start with some party combination tips. Definitely recommend having some sort of a frontliner with Recluse. That Raider or Guardian archetypes, really beneficial. Executor and Wylder, not too bad either, but someone that has a much higher HP pool than you that can tank some of those hits are really beneficial to have. I also really like the Recluse and Revenant combo because as the Revenant player, you can get your FP back via the Recluse ultimate, and you've also got that magic cocktail that does the effect as well. But getting some of that FP back as FP generation is so hard as Revenant. The combination of having Revenant as that faith and arcane wielder, and then Recluse as that sort of faith and intelligence, but typically leaning more in that intelligence way. Wielder, you got those sort of 2 ranged potential there. It's quite a fun combination to have. Also, then in that case, you absolutely want to have a melee character. And if you are struggling with FP generation, you shouldn't typically, if you get a feel for the combo of say using 1 or 2 spells and then drawing the residue, and make sure you're using that magic cocktail regularly, you should be fine with your FP generation. But it doesn't hurt to run a couple of Starlight Shards as backups, especially in say the Night Lord fight when you do want to keep your distance and you want to be using a lot of those higher impact spells that do cost a lot more FP, and can be a little bit hard to generate it fast enough when you're using those expensive spells, like say using Full Moon for example. So having something like Starlight Shards just to help you with that FP generation, also beneficial. So Ironeye really is the ranged powerhouse of the Nightfarers. Now, unlike some of the other Nightfarers that are a bit more flexible in how you choose to build them out each run, for pretty much every single run, you are definitely going to be using a bow, or to a lesser extent a crossbow or a great bow, because they have such low HP across the board. Now, there is a lot of gameplay elements that can help them avoid taking damage, namely their skills, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But ultimately here, your main focus will be on keeping that distance from enemies, but not going too far, because you want to stay within that maximum effective range for your bows, as you'll notice that there is actually weapon damage drop off if you are too far away. Now, because of the distance you can maintain with enemies, it's definitely one of the easier Nightfarers to master or to play, because there's a lot of melee range damage in Elden Ring Nightreign that you can just simply avoid because you're always in range. However, unlike Elden Ring base game, there is actually a lot of ranged mechanics and like targeted abilities that will target one of the Nightfarers, so you do need to be mindful of that and constantly be moving, like say using your marking skill as a movement ability, but there's better ways to use it. Attribute wise for the Ironeye, you start out with C, HP and FP and slightly higher stamina. Ultimately, for your overall stats, Dexterity is an A and Arcane is a B. Dexterity being A is the main stat you want to focus on here for anything. So any Dexterity-based weapons are the main focus, which is obviously bows, so there's not really anything that you need to think about too drastically there. But Arcane being B is fantastic as well because of that extra status build-up, which is fantastic for any bow build with Ironeye. All right, let's break down the skills, starting with the passive. Eagle Eye is the passive. A keenly observant eye discovers more items to obtain from foes. Something to note note, this does apply to you and the rest of your allies as well, but it increases the odds of enemy loot drops on the ground. It doesn't change fixed drops, say like from chest rewards or boss loot, right? Those tables are still going to be the same. It's just that you'll get more loot drops from the random enemies as you're just fighting throughout the world. You'll notice they'll drop items more often. The main skill is marking, which will cuts forward with the dagger almost like a bloodhound step movement to damage the enemy and then apply a weak point. Now that weak point does two things. While the weak point is active on the target, it will lower the target's resistance to damage from all sources by roughly 10%. Now, as Ironeye, you can use like the aim down sights reticule to target that weak point. If you do so, you'll notice that the red aura of the marking will actually get darker red, and then eventually it'll like burst, which will create a stagger effect on the enemy and give you like a chunk of damage similar to like a blood loss. It won't knock them down immediately for a critical hit, but it will stagger them like a critical hit. So the main focus of marking, especially on bosses, is to trigger that effect as much as possible, especially on some of the harder bosses that have these unique mechanics that you want to knock them out of, which you can do by using this, marking them as a weak point, and then melting them as fast as you can, breaking that weak point for that extra damage potential. That's one of the key trade-offs that you get for Ironeye. Because you have that lower amount of overall damage because you are ranged, even though range is significantly more improved here than it was in Elden Ring, but essentially using this weak point mechanic to deal additional damage and then staggering enemies with that weak point break will make you a significantly better Ironeye player, and it's a huge difference between like an average Ironeye player that's either using marking just as movement ability, it is a great movement ability, don't get me wrong, or just say marking and then not bursting it. If you burst it as much as possible, you'll definitely see much more success. The ultimate here is single shot. Now this fires a powerful arrow that surpasses sounds and ignores any defense. What this means is that it pierces through all enemies, terrain, structures, absolutely everything. You can hold this down for a brief moment to lengthen the charge time. Charging it for longer doesn't increase its damage, but it does increase the invulnerability window, so you can avoid damage for longer, or if you need to say re-aim your shot, so you want to focus on a different enemy while you're just charging that up. A really good ultimate to use on like trash enemies, because it will basically one-shot them because it pierces through all of them in that like massive area. It's still good for bosses, but it's definitely not like one of the best for bosses. So I would definitely be using this throughout, like when you're trash clearing, or say if you're fighting a boss that has a lot of trash, you definitely want to make sure you're piercing through all that trash and killing them. It's also great to revive allies as well because of the long range that it does have. You can hit the boss and revive your ally with it as well. While you're out on runs and expeditions, there's only really a couple of things that you need to think about as Ironeye, because it's a very clear build progression for every single run. Firstly, when you're looking at the map, if you bring up the details, you can have the option to look at the various areas and see which areas have a higher chance of spawning bows, because that's exactly what you want to look for. So make sure when you are looking at the map, bring up the details, look for the areas that have a little bow symbol. They have a higher chance of spawning bows, and that's exactly where you want to go. While crossbows and great bows do work for Ironeye as well, the bow is typically faster and better to use because of its easier, like faster attack speed and just easier movement abilities around it. So I typically have always lent in that option. The great bow isn't bad to like clear trash because of the stagger, and then you could use a crossbow, but I've always just found them very cumbersome. While you're looking for weapons, try to find bows that have status effects, and don't be afraid to run multiple bows. Say for example, if you have one bow that applies poison, run that in your main slot, apply poison to the enemy or rot or frostbite, whatever status effect you have, and then switch to a bow that has a higher overall like physical damage output. When you're looking at bows and trying to figure out what works best, I've typically lent into bows that have weapon skills of rain of arrows or barrage. You won't use a lot of FP as Ironeye, especially with the others like say mighty shot. It's just kind of too slow, and sky shot misses all the time, so it's better just then in those cases just to use your basic arrows. But with rain of arrows or barrage, you can easily get say status effects applied with barrage or a good amount of AoE damage with rain of arrows. Now look, you can melee if you want to. I just wouldn't recommend it because it's so hard to avoid damage as Ironeye, and just like making mistakes and taking damage will essentially one-shot you until you get to the higher level. So definitely be cautious about that. But if you want to melee, totally can. I just really don't think this is the character for you if you want a melee. It's all hard in on the bow. I have sometimes worn a melee weapon in my off offhand, though, what I would recommend for your offhand is to try and find items that have those equipped bonuses. For example, in one of the runs, I was able to get a shield that while walking would spawn lightning around me. Now, while you're aiming down sights with the bow and you have that reticule up, that's technically walking, so the lightning was spawning while I was using that. So try and find those combos with something in your offhand that has that like equipped bonus, and then you've also got that as well as whatever you're using in your main hand, which are typically two-hand, because you need to two-hand to get that reticule aim down sights view. When thinking about the relics to equip for Ironeye, there's a few things to look out for. Firstly, getting Ironeye's remembrance to 5 is hugely beneficial. This isn't too hard to do. Once you have done the first couple of remembrances, you will have to defeat a version of yourself on the map. Once you've cleared that and completed the remembrance, you'll get the Ironeye's chalice, which is a relic combination that has a white slot, which can be then have anything equipped in it of any color, which is a really beneficial chalice to get very early if you are looking to play Ironeye. One of the better relics for Ironeye actually comes after you beat the Night aspect, the final Night Lord. What this does is switching weapons adds an affinity attack. So every time you switch weapon, it will add an additional attack like elemental damage to that weapon, plus increase the bonus attack power of affinity attacks, and switching attacks boosts attack power. So every time you switch weapon, you'll get an additional attack power bonuses in these elemental effects. What I recommend if you are using this is to run multiple bows in your like right hand and then switch between them regularly when this effect ends, for you constantly getting that additional damage effect and that elemental damage on top of what you're already doing. Now, in terms of the relics to equip, really, there's a couple of things I would look out for. Firstly, anything that increases your overall dexterity. That's literally just increasing your overall damage by however much that dexterity increase is. Something that will add a ailment status effect to your starting weapon, like poison, for example, and then even other effects that lean into that. Say, for example, when poison is in the vicinity, increases attack power up when facing poison afflicted enemies. Anything that's like that, that adds those benefits, because there are plenty of bows you'll come across that have these effects on them. After you've beaten a few Night Lords, the jar vendor will sell you a Grand Lumio scene that has Ironeye extends duration of weak point on it, plus endurance and dexterity. Fantastic, guaranteed drop once you've beaten, I believe it's 4 Night Lords, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Now, Ironeye's best relic does actually come from his remembrances, but it's one of the later steps. Now, Edge of Order is that relic. Now, it does boost thrusting counterattacks after executing art, which is fine, but the real kicker here is the improved bow attack power, which gives you almost 10 additional attack power just with your starting bow, and obviously that translates to any bow that you are using. The downside is that Ironeye's remembrances is probably one of the hardest to complete. So to complete Remembrance Step 6, you need to beat the Dark Drift Knight as Ironeye with the Remembrance active. This is one of the hardest bosses in my opinion, but if you have a lightning weapon, it absolutely helps this encounter go a little bit smoother, as the boss is weak to lightning and it can stagger him out of his attacks. Now, after you've completed this, the final step of the Ironeye's remembrance, you actually need to beat the Night Lord. Once you reach step 8, it's not actually a remembrance specifically, but that final step, you actually need to beat the Night Lord as Ironeye, and then there will be a additional option. I'm being quite vague here to avoid spoilers, but when you interact with the character at the end, there'll be an additional option which will complete Ironeye's remembrance and give you a different ending to the game. And it's also not that bad of an idea while you're on a run to just level up Ironeye's bow, especially if you've got an affliction on that, like poison. You can then get these attack power bonuses up on your relic just by that bow. You already know you've got a poison bow. And then anything that is like Ironeye specific, like the character skill that increases the duration of weak point. Things like that are definitely what you want to look out for in terms of relics. A couple of tips for Ironeye just generally on runs. Marking is a fantastic movement ability, but it's definitely not its main focus, and I would highly recommend to try and actually hit enemies with this. However, there are some bosses, especially flying bosses, that it's like almost impossible to hit them unless they do come to the ground. That's when I would be leaning into it as a movement ability, but its flexibility is what makes it really strong, in that you can use it to get away. It has such a quick cooldown, but you mainly want to be hitting enemies with it and then triggering those staggers like we were talking about earlier. One of the other benefits to Ironeye is how heavy attacks now have like a shotgun blast of those 3 arrows. I would typically only be using this on the larger enemies that say you can hit with all 3 arrows. Like if you're using it on trash, it's typically higher damage just to use that single shot arrow. But if you're fighting larger enemies, using a charged heavy attack with those 3 arrow burst out, definitely better for those larger enemies where you can hit with all 3. Aiming down sights with that additional reticule does do slightly more damage than just the typical like locking onto targets and shooting your arrows. But something to note is that enemies that move around very rapidly, it's much better to just like lock yourself on and then just shoot at them, because the arrow will mostly auto target them. Whereas the reticule, because you have to aim it yourself, it is a little bit harder on those enemies that move a lot quicker. But definitely use that reticule aim down sights when triggering those weak point damage. It's much easier to do. And for other Nightfarers to come with you, I would highly recommend to get your allies to run a Raider or a Guardian. Especially a Raider is so beneficial to have with an Ironeye because of their ultimate that not only increases your overall attack power, but that tombstone, you can climb up to the top of it, you can stand up there. You can still get hit while you're up there, so you're not actually immune from damage. Be mindful of that, but you can then just wail on the enemies while you're up there. And that same advice is relevant to regardless of whether you have a Raider or a Guardian or whatever, right? Like high ground is so beneficial for the Ironeye. Anywhere that you can avoid taking damage, just stand still and pop shots at enemies is fantastic. That's really the benefit of Ironeye, is because of that range damage potential. And he's definitely one of my favorite characters. I've played him the most throughout the review period and have really been enjoying playing Ironeye, and I'm sure you will as well. Here you unlock the Duchess. It's actually quite simple. All you need to do is complete the Tricephalles expedition, which is the very first one. You just need to beat it once. At the very end of that event, you'll get an item called the Old Pocket Watch. You just need to take this to the priestess at the round table. I won't spoil what happens, but at the very end of that whole shenanigan cutscene, you'll have the Duchess unlocked and you'll be able to play her from there on. Duchess's playstyle is extremely mobile. It's also accentuated by her passive that definitely allows her to dodge repeatedly and endlessly, but this allows her to get behind enemies for a lot of critical hits. It also allows her to dance with enemies and employ a lot of like hit and run, finesse orientated play styles that can be hard to achieve for some of the other Nightfarers. Her weapon preference is a dagger. Now, daggers can often come with blood loss or rot or poison or whatever, and you definitely want to lean into those daggers that have those status effects, because it's so beneficial to have a weapon with status effects when you're dual wielding daggers. And it's also important to dual wield with Duchess. It just really fits her overall playstyle and her kit. Now, something that's interesting about the Duchess's attributes, she has C HP, B FP, D stamina. That stamina is quite low. Strength is D, dexterity is B, intelligence is A, and faith is B, and arcane is C. So by the stats, her FP and her intelligence are her highest starting stats, which would typically mean that you would want to lean into, say, using staves and maybe casting some spells, which, I mean, you could do, but it just isn't really her overall play style. Instead, what I'd be looking for is using weapons that have magic damage on them, or alternatively, leaning into weapons that have fantastic weapon skills. Because of that high FP that she has, being B, you will be able to get a lot more weapon skills off than some of the other classes or Nightfarers. A good example of this is, say, Rivers of Blood, for example, which is just as broken in Nightreign as it is in the original Elden Ring. Because of how much FP that attack consumes and how regularly you'll use it, someone like Duchess is quite beneficial to use this. One, because her dexterity is pretty solid, and two, because she has a high amount of FP that she can continually use the Corpse Piler and actually use that weapon skill. Let's break down her skills as a whole. Starting with the passive, Magnificent Poise. This allows you to dodge optimally and dodge repeatedly when necessary is the description. But essentially what it means is that you can chain 2 dodges together, and she has a unique dodge animation. It does also cost her less stamina to dodge than some of the other Nightfarers, which is very beneficial considering her low starting stamina, which is something you might want to look at. Now, something to note here is that this is very beneficial to combo with lunging attacks. Think of something like a dagger that has that sort of dodge, and then you lunge forward and slash with the dagger just with the basic attack. If you can combo these together with weapons that have these really strong lunging attacks, it's extremely beneficial for the Duchess. Her skill is Restage. Now, this stages reprisal of recent occurrences of damage on nearby enemies. So what this means is that when you trigger this ability, the last like 3 seconds will play out again on a phantom version of that enemy with those same hits that they took applying again. Something to note about this is those phantoms can't be damaged again, like you can't damage them after the fact like when they exist. However, they are affected by any armaments or weapon skills and status effects damage that the original enemy was affected with. So for example, if you're trying to apply a status effect, poison, scarlet rot, whatever it may be, if you've applied applied stacks of that to the enemy and then you use restage, it will apply those stacks along with the damage again. So you can use this to fast track applying the status effect quite quickly, but it is often best to save it until, say, you've done a critical hit on the enemy, or you see one of those big status effect pops, like using blood loss or frostbite. When you see a big chunk of the enemy health bar go down, that's that immediate point that you want to trigger this. And it does about 50% of the damage that the original target received, roughly. You can buff it with a relic we'll talk about later, but just generally that's kind of what you can expect. The ultimate here is called Finale, to obscure self and surrounding allies to hide from foes. What this essentially does is it drops all aggro from most enemies. Enemies will lose track of you and just like wander aimlessly, and you can essentially just like wander around. Now, this is really beneficial to use to revive your allies in some boss fights or just when you're out in the world and say, maybe you just want to sprint past some enemies. It can be beneficial there as well. But something to note is that you're not immune to damage even though you're invisible. So if you are inside an AoE attack or an enemy is just swinging in your general direction, you can still take that damage, but you can heal freely while you're invisible. Healing does not break the stealth, which is great to allow you to give those moments of quiet when you can heal up and sort of reset yourself. However, it will break if, say, you attack an enemy or you get hit by an enemy. The finale will actually end. On your runs, there's a couple of things that you should be looking out for. Now, the weapon preference being daggers means that you should absolutely be looking for daggers most of the time, especially daggers that have status effects like bleed and frostbite first, typically, because of how those status effects have like that massive chunk of damage that they take when the status effect procs. So because of those big chunks of damage, that is a really great time to use restage. So that's why they're really beneficial. But poison and rot, anything like that is still really good for Duchess. And there's also a lot of relics that can help increase those damage with those effects. And same with the passives that you find on weapons. Generally though, I would definitely run daggers until you find, or in some cases you won't, but unless you find, say, a Rivers of Blood or a really powerful weapon that has a great weapon skill, or it's just something you can't turn down, which does happen sometimes. And it's actually really part of the flexibility of Duchess's kit, because, you know, she's got a solid dexterity, a solid intelligence, a solid faith, a solid arcane, that you can switch between these weapons. If, say, you find one of these finesse katanas, thrusting swords, that sort of weapon categories that, you know, you find one that you like, you get a legendary weapon or something, you can easily use these, and you've got that high amount of FP, so you can regularly use those weapon skills and lean into them for your builds. For passives, when you're looking at passives for the different weapons in your other slots, look for things that increase your attack power, your HP, your stamina, those things from the boss rewards. But ultimately it depends a little bit on the run that you're having. Magic attack power is definitely really beneficial to have as a passive because of the benefits of Duchess's high intelligence, so you do extra magic damage, but that's obviously only relevant if you are using a magic weapon. Obviously you need to tailor that towards the run that you're having, but that's part of Duchess's fun factor to me anyway, is how flexibility she is. And sometimes you just find a really cool weapon and you're like, yep, I'm going to use that now, and you don't have to lean into, you know, Wylder, for example, you're basically locked into using greatswords because that's like the only thing that he's good at. But you've got a lot of freedom with Duchess in terms of whether you want to use katanas or, you know, curved swords, daggers, whatever that may be. Completing Duchess's remembrance is hugely important to make her one of the better Nightfarers, as it further buffs her damage dealing and status applying capabilities, but also her final remembrance relic adds vigor and continuous HP regen, but we'll cover that in a second. Until you get through the Duchess's remembrance, one of her better relics you can run is purchasable via the jar vendor. Once you've beaten a few Night Lords, his stock will update and you'll be able to buy some epic quality relics, and the one that you can buy, the Grand Tranquil Scene, gives the Duchess improved character skill attack power. So this increases the attack power of Restage by about like 8-10%, something like that. Something to note is that you can find this on relics that you find, you know, at the end of your run, but this effect doesn't stack. Like if you've got two of these, which I have, and if you put both of them on, it won't stack and increase it by like a further 10%. You could only do that once. And the other reason that this relic is good is because of extra dexterity and intelligence. Duchess's Remembrance is one of the easier ones. Like you'll just really need to progress through defeating Night Lords with Duchess to unlock those next steps. And then you'll just need to return to Limveld, which you can do solo to like defeat a certain boss, to collect an item, things like that you would typically do. There are two specific steps that I will point point out to help you along the journey. One of them being Remembrance 5, which is when you have to find Wylder. Like he's like hiding at the Round Table Hold, and it's one of the only times that where you have to go isn't actually marked on the map. He is actually located outside past like the kitcheny area. If you turn right near where the Executor's painting is, just around the corner there, he's just chilling there with some pita bread that you can talk to him while he's there and complete that remembrance. And then at Remembrance 7, you are required to enter Limvale to collect an item, but you're also required to beat Revenant in a 1v1, except she uses all of her summons, so it's really like a 1v4. This fight is pretty tough, and I highly recommend you to employ hit and run tactics with like a lunge attack with your dagger, and like we was discussing earlier in the video, and then restage to increase that chip damage. So hit them once, use restage, get that like extra bit of damage, and then just like run around and avoid the attacks. Something to note about this fight, same as if you are trying to unlock Revenant, which you can go watch my Revenant video once that's out as well if you want more information, is that Revenant's summons and her own personal attacks are less aggressive when all of her summons and everything is up. The more summons you take out, the more aggressive she becomes, more aggressive the remaining summons become. So it's often beneficial to leave them all alive and just do your best to dodge the page and like the pumpkin head, and the, you know, the skeleton doesn't do too much, but avoid them and just attack her, because the more you destroy, the more dangerous she actually becomes. Completing this will give you the Crowned Medal. Now, this is a fantastic relic. So for Duchess, dagger chain attacks reprise events upon nearby enemies. Essentially, this gives you a free restage after you've used a certain amount of dagger attacks, plus it also improves dagger attack power. Not much else to say here other than it's absolutely fantastic for daggers, which is what you should be using as Duchess most of the time. And then the last Remembrance, Remembrance 8, is very easy to complete. You just need to jump back into the Remembrance, and you will get a Blessed Iron Coin after completion, which defeating enemies while art is active, it increases your attack power, but also you get that continuous HP recovery and Vigor +3, which is really beneficial because of Duchess's health related issues. She doesn't have a lot of it. It's very easy to die, like just get one shot with Duchess. So that definitely helps with that extra Vigor and the HP regen. Now you may have noticed that all of the relics we have discussed are green. There is actually a only green relic urn that you can get from the jar vendor. You will need to defeat, I think it's about 6 Night Lords in order to unlock this item. Let me know in the comments if it's less, but I believe this showed for me when I had defeated 6, but I may have actually just forgotten to check earlier. But once you've got this item, you'll be able to equip all the 3 relics that we've discussed. But until that point, you could use the chalice that you get for doing the remembrances, because it has that free white slot. Now it's a yellow relic, so it doesn't fit with our overall theme of best relics that we're going for with Duchess, but Knight of the Miasma, I just wanted to call out as it's just like absolutely fantastic for Duchess. So this comes from defeating Fisher of the Fog, the 7th Night Lord. Nearby Frostbite conceals self. So what this means is that anytime there's Frostbite, you essentially get your ultimate for free for a short period of time. This will drop any aggro that you have on enemies. Fantastic for Duchess that doesn't want enemies attacking her very often, but it also adds Chilling Mist to your starting weapon, so you can trigger that Frostbite with your starting weapon regularly, and attack power up when facing Frostbite afflicted enemies. Lots of benefits for Frostbite and for Duchess specifically. But also when you're just like looking at your relics, look for things that increase your dexterity, your critical hit bonuses, HP, stamina improvements, those sort of things, as well as obviously anything dagger related, absolutely beneficial for the Duchess. A couple of tips for the Duchess to close us out: weave your dodges with lunging attacks. You will be surprised at how beneficial using lunging attacks are and weaving in your dodges. Hit and run tactics, like we talked about with Revenant, absolutely beneficial to use on bosses and enemies in general. She is really not a face tanking character, and you want to try and get behind enemies, do those critical hits and avoid damage as much as possible. That's why she's often good to combo with characters like a Raider or a Guardian that can tank the damage for her and really get the focus of the enemy. Then she can attack from behind for those critical hits and just really focus on applying status effects and then dodging all of the projectile damage that really comes her way. She's really not a frontline like damage dealer that should be tanking damage in any particular way. Really, it's a finesse orientated character that is quite a fun playstyle if you can master it, but definitely has a higher skill cap because of how much damage she can take and very easily get one shot in the early stages of expeditions, which has absolutely happened to me numerous times. So firstly, to unlock the Revenant, once you have unlocked the Duchess, you can purchase the Besmirched Frame from the Small Jar Bazaar, the guy that you can buy stuff from at the Round Table Hold. It's pretty cheap. And then once you purchase this, you'll see a Phantom of Revenant just hanging out in the east wing of Round Table Hold. Interact with the Phantom and you'll be taken back to the tutorial area, and you have to beat Revenant and her 3 spirit summons. A couple of tips for just generally doing this, as it is quite a challenging encounter, is that the more of her summons that are active, the less aggressive they all are and herself, so they won't attack you as much. If you can pick a character like even say Duchess, for example, touching on her again, to sort of weave in like a hit and run tactic to run in, hit Revenant and then run out, or if you just want to take out all the summons and then just deal with Revenant one-on-one, you can do that as well. But just keep in mind that she will be more aggressive when it is just her casting things like discuses and all this sort of nonsense at you. So it is a challenging fight, but once you've beaten her, you will have her unlocked. Now the playstyle for Revenant is very much a backline damage dealer, but also a little bit of a support because of the ultimate, but really heavily focused on faith incantations. But you could potentially dip into staves, but like I would think in that case, you'd rather play Recluse. Now, what's great about her is that she has an extremely high starting FP and the highest faith scaling of any character, being S scaling. The downside is that she has the worst starting HP and stamina of any of the characters, being D, and her strength and dex is also at C, and intelligence and arcane are at B. So because you've got a fair amount of arcane as well as faith, really good for any sort of dragon communion incantations, anything that typically requires a high amount of faith, and you will deal a ton of damage with these incantations and getting them off, especially the dragon communion ones, if you can find yourself a seal that does have them. The downside to her overall kit in general is, one, she has no weapon preference, which means that literally anything can drop for her when you're out exploring. In a way, it's a good thing because you can sort of tailor your build to whatever boss you're fighting for the weaknesses and also use whatever drops for you. But the bad thing about that is that it does take a while for things that you actually want to use to drop. Like you really have to seek them out sometimes as Revenant, and we'll touch on ways you can do that a little bit later in this video. But ultimately here, she is a backline caster with some fantastic summons that prevent her from taking damage. Speaking of those skills, her passive is Necromancy. This raises enemy ghosts to fight as allies. So anytime that Revenant deals a killing blow, there is a chance that that enemy will raise again as a phantom to then attack. Now, something to note, this won't work for like large bosses, but any fodder enemies and like elites work, like pumpkin heads, banished knights, and any of the fodder enemies you find, it does work for them. In order for them to actually be revived, Revenant does need to deal the final blow on that target and actually finish them off. I don't think there is a limit to how many phantoms can be summoned, but I do believe it's like a percentage chance or something that of them can actually come back, because it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen quite regularly. This is really beneficial against those like end of day bosses when you've got those like fodder enemies that spawn before the boss. If you let Revenant take all of these out, she basically gets like a phantom army to then fight that boss when it does summon until they do wear off. The skill is the main summons though. That is Summon Spirit, where she will use the lyre to summon a fallen member of her family. You've got three options here to choose from. Helen, the page, who's a dexterity focused that uses a rapier for thrusting attacks, best used against fast moving enemies and smaller enemies. Typically the main summon that you will use quite regularly in encounters because they move a lot quicker to sort of close the distance for enemies. Frederick, the burly cook, is a blunt damage pumpkin head basically that's fantastic to use in AoE scenarios when there's lots of enemies, then you want him to swing around and take them all out. Also against anything that's weak against blunt damage like the Crystallians, he's fantastic for that. Sebastian is the giant skeleton that you can summon and best used for stationary enemies as well as bosses. Does the most damage but can't move like the others can, so can be very hard to get Sebastian in the right spot, and definitely want to pay attention to Sebastian's positioning. He will roar when he can't reach enemies, which can do a bit of range damage and pull enemies towards him, sort of like a taunt, but definitely not as useful for some fast moving enemies. Now, when you don't have a summon active, as you only have one summon active at a time, they will gradually restore HP. You can see their HP at any time in the bottom left corner of your screen, and then you can resummon them at any time and use them in combat. They won't deal a ton of damage. It is beneficial damage, like you definitely want to have them out, but typically you're using them as distractions to prevent things from attacking Revenant directly, as she has such a low amount of health that you'll basically get one shot anytime you make a mistake. Something else to note about the summons is that they can also revive allies and yourself. If they are close by to them, they will actually go over and revive your teammates as well as you. The ultimate is Immortal March. Now, this releases a vengeful ire to make self and nearby allies immortal. So what that means is that you cannot die, basically. But that doesn't mean you can't take damage. So you will take damage and go down to literally 1 HP sometimes, but you won't actually die when this is active. So make sure you do have enough healing to keep yourself alive, or just like don't take damage while you do have this active. But when you do use Immortal March, it will revive near-death allies. So anyone that's near you, it will immediately revive them. And whatever's active summon you have at the time will perform a additional attack. For Helen, this is a swift rapier combo where she jabs forward. For Frederick, it's a multi-hit spinning attack with his hammer. And for Sebastian, it's like Ghostfire long range like beam that he shoots out of his face. Now, while you can buff this ultimate with relics to do Ghost Flame damage as well, so that you can get a little bit of extra damage out of it, it is mostly used as a way to revive allies and keep yourself alive in supporting scenarios. You're very rarely going to use it offensively as an attack. It is significantly better used as a defensive weapon to restore your allies if they go down, as you're invulnerable while you're in that animation, so you can quickly revive them, especially if they have like 3 pips, like they've gone down 3 times. So really you want to hold this in any boss fight until you absolutely have to use it, and then pop it to save the day. The progression for Revenant and things you should look out for, realistically, it's finger seals. That's the main thing you want to use. Now, when you're looking at the map, bring up the map details, which will tell you at what locations various items have a higher chance for spawning. And you're obviously looking for the finger seals because you want to have as many finger seals as possible, because that's your main way of doing damage. I'm actually kind of like the claws that she starts with, and I'm not opposed to upgrading them, especially if you're using a relic that adds like a status ailment to them. Like I'm using a relic that adds poison to the fingers, and because they're such a fast attacking weapon, you can get that status off pretty quickly. So it gives you a little bit of extra damage, and they're quite easy to upgrade, as with the Smithing Stone 1 is simply fine. By the way, because the claws are fist weapons, you can two-hand them for those typical fist combos. And I do recommend to have some sort of a bow with you, so you've got a ranged option as well. So finding a bow somewhere on the battlefield before you get into bosses is beneficial, so you can keep your distance when you do run out of FP, because that is Revenant's major weakness, is their FP regeneration. As unlike the Recluse, who can regenerate FP with their skill, there is no way to do that here as the Revenant. So the best way for you to generate FP is by picking passives that are FP relevant, increasing your maximum FP, giving you some sort of FP restoration on successive attacks, for example, something like that. Or even as well, you can find passives on weapons that will restore FP when you have them in your offhand, like from attacks. But keep in mind that those attacks have to be weapon attacks, not spells. But it's just any way that you can get FP back is really beneficial. The main way is obviously through Starlight Shards, which you should be buying these from any of the merchants you find, especially the one before the Night Lord at the end of your run. Definitely want to have as many Starlight Shards with you as possible on any run, so that you can restore your FP. And then if worse comes to worse, if you've got a bow range weapon with you, you can stay alive in that regard and still deal damage from ranged. Or if you have to, you've got the claws you can lean on in melee range as well. But you could use a melee weapon. Like I did have this great run with the Marika's hammer, and you know, there is the option to use melee weapons here, but it's just, you got to be really careful because of your health. Like you will get one shot, especially until you reach like level 8 or 9, where you've got a little bit more health. You can at least take one hit. Before that point, you make one mistake and you'll get one shot. And that's where these summons are really useful. All right, let's talk about relics and remembrances. Now, as always, the best relics come from the remembrance progression for all of the characters. Now, for Revenant, the remembrance is pretty simple. The main task that you actually need to do is to beat Tricephalus or the Dark Knight Drift while in the remembrance. Highly recommend to do Tricephalus and not Dark Drift Knight. Dark Drift Knight is a very tough boss, especially if you're early in your Revenant career and you just don't have these relics that can really back you up. The Tricephalus is the first boss in the game, super easy to do. Definitely recommend doing that. Now, by just simply doing this and then progressing through the remembrance, you don't have to do anything else or gain anything. You just have to continually go back into the remembrances and progress her story, and you'll get 2 fantastic relics out of it. The very first one that you gain is called the Small Makeup Brush, and the Revenant will power up while fighting alongside family. That's your summon. So as long as you have a summon active, you'll actually gain additional attack power, plus the increased rune acquisition for self and allies is also quite beneficial. Now, the old portrait is the one you get for completing Revenant. Remembrance. Now, this comes with 2 specific passives, one being to expend own HP to fully heal nearby allies when activating art. So that means whenever you use your ultimate, you'll fully heal your allies to expend all of your health. It'll keep you alive because you can't go down while you've got your ultimate active. You'll stay alive with 1 health, but just keep that in mind. And then the trigger Ghost Flame Explosion during ultimate art activation will increase the overall damage that your Immortal March does. Now, something to note is that while you're still early in your Revenant career, you can actually get a variant of that skill from the jar vendor. Once you've beaten 4 Night Lords, you'll be able to purchase the Grand Drizzly Scene from the jar vendor, which has that effect. Plus, it also has +2 Faith and +2 Arcane, which is really beneficial. Knight of the Miasma is also fantastic for Revenant. This comes from beating the Fisher of the Fog, the 7th NIGHTFARER. Now, this comes with Nearby Frostbite Conceal Self. That's the main reason you want this. For Revenant, you can't actually change your starting weapon to add Chilling Mist, but anytime there is Frostbite near you, this conceals self, making you invisible like the Duchess ultimate. This will drop any aggro that you may have on target, so fantastic for someone like Revenant that really doesn't want enemies attacking her. And then for any of the other relics, you're really looking to anything that increases your incantations or your faith or mind, anything that really helps you with that FP generation. A couple of tips for the Revenant to close us out here. Because of that serious lack of FP, you really do want to make sure you are buying Starlight Shards from all the merchants that you come across. It is actually really important, especially before the last boss, and ask your friends to buy you Starlight Shards from any of the merchants with any of the leftover runes they have. Really does help, because in Nightreign, different to Elden Ring, they actually give you a massive chunk of FP at once rather than regenerating your FP over time, so you can quickly pop one and then go back to casting any of your incantations. I do recommend to carry a ranged weapon, as mentioned as well, in case you do run out, so you can stay in the distance. And for combos for the Revenant, in terms of like who other party members you should bring, definitely a frontliner, someone like a Raider, a Guardian, Wylder, or Executor, not too bad either, but someone that can frontline for you and take some of that damage, because you really want to be avoiding getting too close and personal and having enemies attack you, especially because of their heavy hitting attacks that will one-shot you in the early stages of the game. And Recluse is actually a low-key fantastic partner because of the Soul Blood Song ultimate that restores your FP when you do hit enemies. So it's a really good way. Also, you get HP back when you hit, but to get some of that FP back, as you'll be using quite a lot of it here, it's quite valuable to get some back in a rapid succession when they do use their ultimate. If you're still looking for more Elden Ring Nightreign content, here is a link to my run guide that covers exactly how an expedition should go, what to look out for, and how to beat that final boss. But thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.